So welcome everyone to Virtual Author Hour with Carol Edgarian in conversation with Holly Hubbard Preston. My name is Kelsey Frazier and I am the Napa Bookmine representative for this evening. We're very happy to have you all here. Just a few logistical things to start. You should be muted upon entry, so you don't need to worry about muting yourselves. But if you would like to ask questions at any point, you can drop them either into the chat box or wait till the last 10 to 15 minutes, and we will be taking questions from you directly if that's something that you're comfortable with. So 2 options there. I will also drop a link to the book in the chat box in case you are inclined to purchase it at any point during the event. You'll have that there. And I think that's it. Well, the one last thing is if you would like to just be able to see Carol and Holly speaking, I recommend going up to the view and just changing it to speaker view. That kind of takes away all of the other audience members and makes it a little bit easier to listen sometimes. But I think that is it logistically. So I will move on to introducing our guests. With us tonight, we have Carol Edgarian, who's the author of New York Times bestseller 3 Stages of Amazement and the international bestseller Rise the Euphrates, which also won the ANC Freedom Prize. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and W, among many others. She's co-founder and editor of Narrative, a digital publisher of fiction, poetry, and art, and Narrative in the Schools, which provides free libraries and writing resources to teachers and students around the world. She lives with her family in San Francisco. And joining Carol in conversation tonight, we have Holly Hubbard Preston, who's a freelance journalist, essayist, and most recently published fiction author. So I will hand it over to Holly to take it away from there.
Well, Carol, it is a real treat to have you online with us tonight for this Zoom conference. We have RSVPs from people who are trickling in now from all over the country, as far away as Tennessee and possibly New York and Southern California, and also here in the Napa Valley, but also San Francisco, where you are, I believe, this evening.
I am.
So thank you for joining us. And Carol was saying before we went live that she's probably done about 40 of these book tours and talks and podcasts altogether since the launch of VERA. So thank you. I know this means a lot to readers to be able to get your sort of first person authorial perspective on writing a book like this. So as Kelsey mentioned, this is your 3rd novel. You wrote your first book, Rise the Euphrates, to much critical acclaim. It was debuted in 1994. And then you had the 3 Stages of Amazement, which your first book was set in Connecticut, which I believe is where you're from.
A long time ago, but yes.
Yes, and that you went to school out here, went to university at Stanford, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then have lived in San Francisco ever since, which is where your second book is set, The 3 Stages of Amazement. And then your 3rd book, VERA, which came out, is also set in San Francisco, though at a different time. I think your Stages of Amazement was set in 2008.
Yeah, the financial
2008.
collapse. Yeah.
It's been compared to the sort of a female version of Jonathan Franzen's book, and which was held also another book in critical acclaim, yours. So we have these 3 books, and when I was reading through them, I saw that all 3 feature, very strong female protagonists who are, identities in flux. They're displaced geologically, in the case of VERA, and also metaphysically. So the books all share that in common, but then sort of really diverge from there. And so we have VERA. You have a book where you've gone into San Francisco, 1906. We're following a female protagonist who's 15 years old, survivor of, the second that I've read, the second strongest, worst earthquake we've had in California. And you follow her in the hours and days to follow. And since this is historical fiction, it kind of makes sense that we maybe excavate down through time and place of your life and start maybe with the overarching question of why this story, why this story, telling this story spoke to you in particular.
That's a great place to start. And thank you, Holly. Thank you for talking with me and what I know is going to be a great conversation. It's interesting when you talk about the three novels. I think I'm always drawn, though I tend to back into things. I mean, if I looked across time, I'm always drawn to a moment in time when society is abruptly changing or is in crisis. I'm also drawn to politics, and 1906 San Francisco was a time of great corruption in San Francisco and political corruption. And in fact, the mayor, Eugene Schmitz, was going to be indicted the morning of the quake. And that's interesting to me. And I think the third element that I'm always drawn to is, you put it so well, but characters who are bent, who are in flux, who are unmoored, and also who are bent on reinvention in some way, who are at a critical moment of change. So all those three things give me lots of room to create drama, and room to work. And it also feeds my own interests in history and politics, and what I guess is a pretty rudimentary way of saying what makes people tick. I always want to know what makes people tick, and it's one of the great things that I love about being a writer, because that's what you do all day. What would someone do when you back them into a room and bring them up against someone else? What does that sword fight look like? Why do people do what they do?
So you mentioned sword fighting, and I think writers do a lot of literary sword fighting with themselves and their characters and their pages and all of that. So I'm curious to know, when did you first start thinking about writing this book, and when did you finally kind of commit to it?
Well, I collect things over time, and I don't know what's going to sort of come back and haunt me enough to make me want to spend what unfortunately is years and years on a book, fortunately or unfortunately. So I started collecting books on the earthquake a long time ago. Maybe in part fascination of being a new Californian. I've been out here now 40 years. But when I first came out here, of course, anybody coming out here thinks earthquake, it's going to happen any minute. What is that about? So I started collecting books on the '06 quake and read them, didn't really think about them, but every time a new one came out, I tended to get it. And then as I was really, I was thinking about this, writing an adventure story that featured a girl who was really contrary and up against societal expectations, and thinking a lot about how does someone like that actually find her footing, find her real voice. It was leading up to the 2016 presidential election, and it seemed to me that was a moment when our society was really at a crossroads, and that a lot of the social norms we had come to expect were really being trampled on and abruptly changing. So that seemed, and the politics of the moment sort of had gotten, as we all know, pretty tough. And rather than take it head on in that moment, I thought, suddenly '06 seemed like the perfect metaphor, when politics and society were really abruptly, seismically changing. And all of a sudden the book came that way. So, you know, it's not like a eureka kind of moment where I wake up and I say, oh, this is what I'm going to do. It just organically starts to coalesce.
So as in a chicken and egg, you had this idea of the earthquake, and then you had this idea of a young female protagonist. I mean, your last protagonist was 42, I think, and now this one's 15. So it wasn't, you just ended up sort of pairing them together.
Well, let me just say, in VERA, the protagonist is 15, but the narrator is a very old woman. And I loved that notion of a very old woman looking back to that moment of being a young woman, becoming a woman, and what happens in those moments, and what happens for someone very old looking back on those moments. I loved that challenge of telling a story from someone who doesn't have the time or the inclination to fuss. Like the story she's going to tell has been distilled in her mind to what is the essence. And that was really fun to work with. Really fun to work with those two voices of a young girl and a much older woman. So I guess maybe I've covered a lot of ages.
Well, I'm curious, when I think this is a side of things that readers don't always know is, you know, you can say, well, I want to write about a character, a young female protagonist, and I think it would be good to set her story in San Francisco, which, you know, in 1906, which there might be some parallels to 2016. This seems like a good access point. But knowing that character, knowing Vera, you know, how easy was Vera to come to know? And when did you feel like you first really started to know her?
She came to me in, I could hear her voice. I could hear her voice. I could hear the much older Vera, and I could also hear the younger Vera. And there was a cadence to her voice and a quickness and kind of that lack of decorum. All of those pieces came really quickly. And then I spend a lot of time with her and with the other characters, getting to know them. I'm putting them in situations that reveal other shades of who they are. I mean, I think characters really become fully dimensional when you see all the contradictions, because that's what's human. So for me, it in the many drafts that I do, it's just constantly challenging the characters and challenging myself to see them in new ways. And a lot of times I'm walking into scenes not knowing, and holding that tension. Sometimes they surprise me. A lot of times they surprise me, and I love that. When there comes a moment when they become so real that they kind of dictate what they're going to do next.
So is it fair to say, because I know there are a number of characters in the book that were based on real people, or that are real people from history. I was reading up on all of them. But is it fair to say that Vera is like a truly organic character, or were there people, real life characters from San Francisco in that time, accounts from girls, you know, I mean, we look at Anne Frank and her diary, she was the same age. Were you able to draw from any 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds, anything that had ever been written, or was this just purely out of your imagination?
Oh, she's pretty much herself. I didn't read about 14 and 15-year-olds. I certainly read, you know, I researched for a couple of years, and really go deep into the research, in part because I want the basis that is historical to be absolutely accurate, but I'm also like a gold miner looking for the nuggets that I'm going to use to fictionalize, and I never know what I'm going to find. So I love that aspect of really learning about a time, about a place. But so the characters who are, there are the real characters. And certainly I take liberties with them too, in terms of how they talk and what they do. But then the whole fictional world is, they, from Rose to Tan to Vera, I hope they're real to the time, but they're not really based on anyone.
You mentioned sort of taking liberties with some of the characters who were real people. And, this is fiction, it's historical fiction. So, I think writing historical fiction, you're up against, well, anytime you bring in real life happenings, either from the past or the present, you have a burden that you carry as a fiction writer.
Mm-hmm.
And fact is stranger than fiction, but, sometimes we have to remind readers of that. How do you sort of sift through what liberties you'll take with a character like Alma Spreckles, de Bretteville Spreckles, or Eugene Schmitz? How do you kind of gauge what liberties you want to take, and what do you want readers to know about that?
That's a good question. So Alma de Bretteville, for those who haven't read the book, she was, her parents were sort of penniless Dutch aristocrats who lived in San Francisco. Her father kind of was a ne'er-do-well, and her mother, in order to keep them, a roof over their heads, sold Danish pastries in the front of the house and gave sailors massages in the back of the house. And Alma was 6 feet tall and gorgeous and very strong personality. And she wanted to be an artist, and she couldn't afford art classes. So she posed nude at the Art Institute to pay for her classes. And willy-nilly was found by some of the leading men in town and made into the statue. She was, her likeness is the statue at the top of Union Square. But also she was famous because she sued a miner who had promised to marry her, and sued him for $50,000 for personal deflowerization. I mean,
Yeah.
You can't make this stuff up.
No, I read about it. I couldn't believe it.
So, I mean, how can I not use that? How can we not play with that? But, and so there's there's an incredible character. She was, and women of that time in San Francisco had that combination of sort of tough ballsiness and confidence and ambition, and not all of them, but some of them. And that was certainly Alma. And of course, fun then to think of Alma and Vera befriending each other, and how would those fates play out, both pre-quake and then on the other side of the quake, and then, onward in their lives. And Alma de Bretteville ends up marrying Spreckles, the Sugar King, and she is the founder of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. She's an amazing character. I could write 10 books about Alma.
She was an amazing woman when you read about her.
Yeah, an amazing woman. And so making those decisions, knowing the skeleton of what she did in her life, to bring her forward, to give her voice, and to give her vulnerability too. You can't, characters want things in fiction. They're not in any way benign about what they want. They want it, and they want it right now. And so on the other side of desire is vulnerability. And so she was really fun to write. And she was also, of course, at the end of the day, at a moment in her life at 25, when the book, for most of the book, she's wondering if this rich guy is going to marry her, and maybe, given some of the elements of where she comes from, she's not good enough. And like, can she have that incredible exuberance and that vulnerability. That's my job, is to show readers both.
And I do want to make time in between questions for you to read a couple of passages. I know you like to read the front of the book where we sort of get to hear from Rose, the narrator, first, because I'm going to want to ask you, I mean, not Rose, Vera. I'm going to want to ask you about Rose, but I think I'll hold off and maybe have you just read sort of the opening.
Okay.
And then we'll talk a little bit about Rose, who is a imagined character, I believe, but we'll find out more about her.
Okay.
Rose, Madam, and the biological mom.
First things. I always thought of my city as a woman, but the house, it turned out, was a woman too. When the quake hit, she groaned. Her timbers strained to hold on to their pins, the pins snapping, and the rocks beneath the house, they had voices too. And if ever I wondered how long it would take for the world to end, I know, 45 seconds. An unearthly stillness preceded and followed the shaking. It's what we did and didn't do in the stillness that determined the rest of our days. I lost 2 mothers that year. The first was Rose. I can't say where she was born or where her kin came from. The fact is, I don't know what mix of blood flows through me. I suspect there's some Persian, possibly Armenian. I understand there may be some Northern African and Spanish in the mix too, and a good pour of French. Spanish by way of Mexico. None of this Rose would confirm or deny. We're mutts, she said, and left it at that. One of the harlots claimed that Rose had been found as a waif in the slums of Mexico City. For a fee, she was brought north. I believe that. I believe most anything when it comes to Rose. She spoke 5 languages, her hair was blue-black, her skin copper, her eyes green. In San Francisco, she became a much favored prostitute, catering to the gold rush miners. Her next clients were the fellows who came after the miners, the suit-wearing bankers and merchants who thought they could gentle a murderous, gambling, whoring town. They thought they could gentle Rose. Instead, she became the grande dame of the Barbary Coast, the Rose of the Rose. She did not raise me. That duty fell to a Swedish widow employed to bring me up to be, I suppose, anything but a hooker. In that, Maury Johnson was successful. I am not a hooker. I am only a thief.
Thank you. Lovely writing, and it sets us right off into that story.
Thank you.
And I wanted you to read that too, because I think it's a good segue to Rose. What's interesting about your characters, all of your characters in this, they didn't strike me as stereotypical. I mean, not Tan, our representative of Chinatown. Even Vera, she's not your sort of classic heroine, she's definitely got her mix of traits, good and bad. So then we get Rose, and Rose is the madam. Rose is the woman who speaks 5 languages. She has a pretty brutal relationship, at least it seems, with Vera, or she's brutal to Vera in some ways, but maybe out of necessity, wanting something better for her. So Rose, tell us a little bit about how she came to be. She is a madam, a very successful madam, a very shrewd businesswoman. She's also, though, caught up in the fraud that you mentioned in the graph that's going on.
Yeah.
Where did she come from? How organic is she, or is she a composite of some people that we might have heard about?
Well, there were great madams at that time. When you think of who founded San Francisco, the city of San Francisco, I should say, the miners did. And then whoever was here to service the miners. And the madams, even at the turn of the century, as San Francisco was becoming more of a tamed, citified place, The madams were still very strong, very much operators, survivors. And so I'd read about a number of them. But Rose came to me. I pulled Rose in part from '06, but again, the tensions of 2016 were really working on me, and thinking about people who just skirt morality, who make their own rules, who there's that kind of toughness, take no prisoner quality. That has always been present, no matter what time or day. But I also thought about what again, what is the opposite of that? Here is a madam who got pregnant. You know, that would not be that would not be a mistake she'd typically make. And instead of getting rid of the child, or, you know, having someone adopt it, she does an interesting thing. She provides for Vera, sets her up in town, close at hand, with someone who could not be more opposite to Rose. And in that way kind of keeps an eye on her. So doesn't mother her, but in kind of almost a masculine way of those days, like provides for her. So she's going to be fine, as if that's enough. Of course, that sets up all kinds of tension in Vera, because she's provided for, but unloved by either mother, and yearns to be with Rose. But so Rose came to me as a bunch of contradictions. And that's always interesting to me. You know, how tough is she? What's underneath that? Is she going to get away with the antics and illegalities that she partakes in? She's not just a madam. She knows everybody's secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very powerful person.
It was interesting, the details that you went into. I think, you know, there's so much sense of place, and we'll talk about that in a minute more broadly, but just the place where Rose lived, her house in Pacific Heights. She also had the brothel, but the way you described her lingerie and the things that were in her bedroom and the opulence of it, some would say the garish opulence of it. How did you, where did you go to mine those details? Because they felt very authentic.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I was thinking, you know, you're a madam, and you're a madam of means. And how would you dress? And is, you know, she has her dress is custom made in Paris, but does she have good taste, or is it a little, you know, is it burlesque? Is it somewhat gauche? Is it over the top? Yeah, it's over the top, you know? So,
And is that what women wore then? I mean, if we went
well, there are women, and then
research.
there are women, and there are madams, right? I mean, one of my, you know, one of the things that's so fun about looking at this time is what women wore underneath everything.
Right.
That whole setup was called a combination. You know, you had your combination, and just isn't that a great word for what it is?
Yeah.
Combination. But also the corsets, you know, the bones, the ribbons, the silks, how many yards of silk it took to make a full skirt in those days. And of course, fashion is always changing. And, you know, is she thin or is she plump? Well, she's a woman of many appetites, right?
Yeah.
So all those things are choices. But what's important to me is that I give you enough detail, and then there are holes that I invite you to bring your subjectivity, your experience, to fill in the gaps.
Well, it was a lot of fun to be a voyeur, at least for this reader, to walk about her house, and I could see it. I thought you did a great job with that. And, you don't introduce the research and quote it, but, you have to be able to write with confidence to bring forth that authenticity. So I thought you did a great job. San Francisco, you are from Connecticut. You've lived here for, you said, almost 40 years. I was born here too. When I read your book, though, for being someone who's from San Francisco, a native of Northern California, I discovered things I didn't know, and I was curious in the writing of this book, and that endeavoring to create that place that would be really central to telling this story. You've lived there. I read a really wonderful piece you wrote in Travel and Leisure in 2003
Yeah.
about the soul of San Francisco, which really felt very much like this book, where you were reflecting on it. I'm wondering what you learned about San Francisco that really surprised you about that time and the place that it was, or the place that it is now, that, many of us wouldn't know, even those of us who were brought up here.
Well, I think, the essential DNA of San Francisco is fascinating to me. And so the more I learn, the more that feels true. That sense of it's always been overpriced, starting with the miners. I mean, they had gold to burn. So a tent during the gold rush days was thousands of dollars. I can imagine what thousands of dollars was in mid 1800s. It's always been a place of entrepreneurial zeal, where people are drawn to create their own next chapter. So very optimistic. I think incredible highs and incredible lows. To imagine a town burning 5 times to the ground and having to reinvent itself, and each time it comes back with that same exuberance. And the other side, and it's just so beautiful. And the typography is so dramatic, highs and lows, microclimates. But always also the other side of all that possibility is a kind of hubris, a kind of blindness, the haves and the have-nots. A sense, the symbol of San Francisco is the phoenix rising. Mm-hmm. But that also begs that there's an inevitable fall. And I think San Francisco right now is very much in that moment of who are we? What mm-hmm. are we? How do we embrace both the incredible success and successful people of the city, and also those who have nothing and who are really on the margins? And that's a kind of tension that's been there since day one.
I want to talk a little bit about the earthquake and the fire that followed. In their own, those are both characters in a way in their own right. And I thought if you just read a short part of that passage, just the opening paragraph about the quake. And so we can talk a little bit about that, what you wrote, and then also what, the reality was and how that informed the book.
Yeah, I'm guessing on 86. Yeah, is that what you're thinking?
86.
Okay. It was the sound of the earth breaking. The quake climbed through thousands of layers of soil and bones and dinosaurs and fossils and bodies of ancestors known and unknown, through the roots of 1,000,000 trees. Next, it was the moan cry of the house, the old-growth redwood weeping as it bent or tried to. 45 seconds is an eternity. Time it if you don't believe me. The shaking went on and on and on. Furniture collided, sections of the ceiling split and fell, no one thing distinct from the next. a cacophony of collapse. In the moonlit shadows, my bureau danced foot to foot, then fell on its face. The bookcase leapt, tripped on the rug, and crashed. The windows bent in their sleeves, straightened audaciously, then burst. The floor undulated in soft, choppy waves. The bed, with Rogue and me riding its top, sailed as if it were a flying carpet. Rogue jumped off, and I had the wits to follow as the headboard hit the windows, busting the last panes of glass. Then mercifully, a pause. I got as far as the door.
That's great, right? You stop right there. So for everyone listening, I really, as a native Californian, I had felt very jaded about earthquakes. I grew up with them. The Loma Prieta, the Bay Area quake of 1989, just for everybody's reference, was a 6.9 magnitude quake. And based on the measurements that we have of that from the time of 1906, we think that it was a 7.8 or a 7.9 magnitude. So that puts some statistical data behind Carol's fantastic descriptions of what those seconds must have felt like for the people in San Francisco at that time. And, you know, it was felt like from Salinas all the way up to our northern border. And it was our most, I think, deadly quake in terms of lives lost and most damaging. And then 80% of the city burned. There was something like, for those of us who live in fire country, which I think is most of California now. So, you know, this rings a certain chord for all of us, I think, a bell. I think there were something like 30 fires going on.
52.
52. Oh my
500 city blocks. And to think about 250,000 people homeless.
Yeah.
250,000 people homeless. And in 1906, what do you do with all of them? I mean, the Navy, they brought in naval boats and put a lot of folks on ships, but many thousands cast adrift in a city that had been reduced to ash. It's an incredible thing. 28,000 buildings.
And, you know, then everything all of a sudden, and there was a very kind of structured class system in San Francisco at that time. And I think you touch on with your writing about Chinatown, and suddenly the whole city is just mixed together, where you have, you know, railroad barons and beggars, you know, kind of side by side in a bread line. And I assume that was, you know, those were real scenes that you drew from to create that sense of place of San Francisco.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of Chinatown, so you know, there were fires. The fires congealed, but the big fire was downtown, and when the gas lines broke, and quickly it moved up the hill, and Chinatown was incinerated. And of course, that just happened, and within hours, some of the city fathers were scheming of how they could just pretend Chinatown didn't exist and you know, and of course there were no records, those all burned. So take over Chinatown, prime real estate, and move the Chinese way to the outskirts of town. And probably that would have happened had Shanghai not protested loudly. Thank goodness, because we would have lost such an important center of culture, and the Chinese would have lost their foothold in San Francisco. But I mean, isn't that amazing that in crisis, somebody is scheming, someone's already scheming of the next thing. But absolutely in the bread lines, and where much of VERA takes place is in Lafayette Square, Lafayette Park, and that was called the millionaires camp, because those tents that people were living in had incredible sweeping views of the bay, And, you know, there is a moment that these two matrons who are not very happy that they're waiting in line for anything in their lives, you know, say, oh my God, we're never going to get rid of these people. They're going to live here forever. But they lived there for a while. And then you can still go in the Presidio, if anybody wants to, and right sort of near the Bay School in the Presidio, there are two earthquake shacks from that time. Have you ever seen that, Holly? You have, okay. They're not easy to find. They're not that well labeled, but you know, they made from the tent cities. Once, you know, here comes winter and it was clear the city couldn't build fast enough. They built these redwood one-room shacks, and everyone shared, you know, communal latrines and kitchens, but one room with a stove and ostensibly a bed. And they were actually not so bad. Redwood floors.
I spent a lot of time in the Presidio when we evacuated from the Napa Valley, our last fire. So just for the audience, we're going to be moving to questions here pretty quickly. So if you want to put some questions into the chat room, or if you feel like raising your hand, we'll kind of go between the two. I just have two quick questions for you.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what the first scene was you ever wrote of this book, and if it's still in the book. When you did, you said you wrote a lot of, you know, editions, versions of your manual.
Oh yeah, I always write and rewrite. The first, you know, the first scene I wrote is not in the book. That's so interesting, Holly. I hadn't thought of that, but it's not. It was a very painful scene to lose, but ultimately I had to. But it brought me to older Vera and younger Vera.
So you didn't lose it. I think this is something always that readers aren't quite aware of. We know where those scenes go away, if you elected to take them away, or if they go away in the publishing process. So you elected to take that out in one of your rewrites.
Yeah.
And how many rewrites of this book?
Oh,
if you admit?
I don't know, because I rewrite as I go. So many. Everything's written many times. I don't know.
And one last question for me on this. What was the hardest part to write about this book? Was it the earthquake? Was it a specific character? Was it plot twist? What was the thing you really struggled with?
That's a great question. It's a very specific moment, and there's a moment when post-quake, Tan, who became, didn't start out, but became one of my very favorite characters. There is a moment when Vera and Tan formed their partnership, and that was a very important moment in the not just in the plot of the book, but when a lot of factors coalesce of who shows up in a crisis for one another, and how do families get made when you don't have family? How do you come to really trust someone? And that was a very delicate dance. And I had to look at it from a lot of different angles till it felt both surprising and correct and just. Those are a lot of elements to think about, and it had to be delicately done. So that was challenging.
Particularly now when we're paying more attention, you know, there's a lot more attention on cultural accuracy and portrayal of characters that, you know, may not be of our own voice. Not that you're appropriating, you can have characters from different walks of life, but you know, there's just a lot more scrutiny there. So that was interesting, because that was a scene that I found very moving and very transformative for Tan and for Vera. I thought it was well done.
Well, let me just say, I mean, the thing about Tan is, you know, it's one thing to talk about being a young woman in 1906 and society putting strictures on you, but to be a Chinese servant in 1906, a man who has great dignity and talents, and the limits that society put on him then, how to work that in a fictional way that was just, and that the story gave him room to show all his dimensions, and not always the most positive dimensions, you know.
Yeah, no, I thought it was very well done. Maybe Kelsey will take a couple of questions, and I have a few more, but we can weave them in.
Yeah, we don't have any questions in the chat box yet, but we do have a comment from Allison, who said that she actually discovered those earthquake cottages recently, and she's very glad they kept them. So
yeah, I am too. I think they're amazing. I hope everybody looks at them.
I've never seen them, and I'm from the Bay Area, so I need to
go check them out.
Yeah. So I guess if anyone has questions and you feel comfortable raising your hand and asking them directly on camera, you are welcome to. In the meantime, Rosemary just asked,
where are they in the Presidio? So let me see if I can, I wish I knew that. So if, do you know where the Y is? You know, okay. If you're driving down past the Y's on your left, and you're about to come to the Bay School, right between the Y and the Bay School on a little alley, you'd see them, and they're green, and there's just two shacks side by side. I mean, really, they're behind a white building. I'm not being clear enough, but
no, that makes sense, because I never walked through that area. I'm always up by the parade ground.
Right. You kind of have to tramp through some backyards to get to it.
Or down at Chrissy Field. So it's kind of in that area. Interesting. I'm going to check it out. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. So we have a couple of questions now. Shannon says that she's not yet read the book, but she would love to know if you had any challenges writing English in the voices of the different characters, especially the Chinese characters.
Yeah, that's a good question. I felt it was important in this time that and in this moment to give the characters proper English, but to also give them the inflection that makes them true to themselves. So Capability, Valentine, I mean, there are many characters of color in the book, and my job is to give them, like I said, their fullness, their complexity, but also their dignity. And Tan is somebody who uses language depending on who and what he's talking about. You know, he's somebody who's got incredible facility to negotiate. And so I tried to give him a little bit of that too.
Great. Elise asks, I noticed in your acknowledgements the name Charles Fracchia. Is he a USF graduate? Just curious. If so, she says she knew him and lost track.
Oh, Charles Fracchia, what an amazing man. He is one of the founders of the San Francisco Historical Society. And I met him late in developing the book. Someone suggested that I call him, and I picked up the phone and called this man. And he said, come on over, bring the book. And I mean, he's one of the great San Francisco historians. And he really became the godfather of the book in a lot of ways. He's the one, a lot of my research taught me that San Francisco had only burned down 3 times. And he said, no, 5 times. And he saved me from some details that would have been off. He was incredibly kind and generous. So is that the Charles Fracchia you're thinking of? I don't know, but a wonderful man.
You know, I'm just going to jump in there with a quick follow-up. Was there, in your research, was there anything that made it into the book that readers might question, not believe, not be able to suspend disbelief, that was actually really true, that really astounded you in your research?
Oh, so many things. So
Or about the
many.
quake?
I was always coming up against things like, you just can't make this stuff up. The horses dancing outside. Caruso came to sing. Caruso's a great story. He was from Naples. Mount Vesuvius had just erupted in early April. I mean, few weeks before. He was in New York, missing his family, feeling very nervous, like that the world was erupting. Got on this train to come west and couldn't sleep. And he couldn't sleep because San Francisco was known as the murder capital of the country. And he thought what he was feeling was, someone was going to hurt him. So finally, and I found this in a little news article. I mean, I could have just passed over it, but supposedly he asked his valet to get off the train at a point and buy him a gun, that he might need the gun. So that little detail, set me off. Of course, he had to have the gun and I had to do something with the gun. And that I completely fictionalized, but that much was true. And the poor guy, he arrives in San Francisco, sings to great acclaim, and goes to sleep in the Palace Hotel. The Palace Hotel was known to be, it had its own reservoir underneath it, so it would never burn. It had alarms on every floor. It was an incredible place. Well, quake happened, fire started, poor Caruso is down on Market Street. And the first thing he does is have his valet go and get his 50 trunks, bring them up and down, up and down. But the palace burned because next door to the palace was the mint, and they couldn't lose the mint. So they took all the water from the palace to save the mint, and the palace burned. And I mean, there just were so many stories of just how fate plays out and foreshadowing. And the horses, the night that Caruso performed, were uncontrollable on the street in the buggies. They just were jumpy. And later people thought they could feel it. They could feel the quake coming, and the dogs barked all night. And it was funny because the other night I was walking with my daughter and all the dogs on the street were barking, and she turned to me and said, "Do you think?"
Yeah, we're due for one, I guess.
We're due, yeah.
Yeah. More questions there?
Well, I think that kind of answers Allison's question. She'd also asked what the most surprising fact about the earthquake that you discovered was in your research, but I think that speaks to that as well. And that is the last question that we have in the chat.
This is Shannon. Can I add something that's Caruso related?
Oh, great.
Discovered some years ago when my now ex-husband and I were creating Martini House restaurant in St. Helena, and Walter Martini was an opera singer in San Francisco who sang with Caruso that night and was earthquaked out and refugeed to Napa Valley, and he was Swiss, and he came to the Swiss community and ran the Swiss Hotel that's still around in St. Helena as a historic property, and did so well during Prohibition bootlegging that he had the money to build the house that is now the Goose and Gander restaurant, but it was the Martini House. And
wow, look at that.
It was the Caruso connection.
There you go. There you go. That's a great story.
Are there, it might be nice, I know it's great to pair some nonfiction when you read a book, a fiction that you really enjoy, or vice versa. And I am trying to find the title about Alma de Bretteville, because there's a new book out about her, I think, or a recent one. But do you have any books to recommend for our listeners, readers that might want to know more about this time in a nonfiction frame?
Yeah, so I threw in some of the notables in the back. in my acknowledgments. One thing that it's not a book, but what I really recommend seeing, because it's just so arresting, is The Trip Down Market Street. Holly, have you seen that? For those of you who don't know about that, someone put a camera attached to the front of a cable car and rolled it down Market Street, and you can see the buggies and the early cars, and people are just walking in front of the cable car. I mean, it's just mayhem. Thank goodness they took that film, and literally a day or two before the quake sent it to New York, otherwise we would have lost it. But then there's a companion film, same shot of going down a cable car and seeing the devastation from the quake. It's really remarkable.
Fantastic. It's amazing.
Yeah. You know, Disaster, the Great San Francisco Earthquake, Simon Winchester's A Crack at the Edge of the World. That's a fantastic book. I also, Gladys Hansen is sort of the godmother of San Francisco quake history. And she had a number of books that are fantastic. Charles Fracchia's books on the subject are amazing. I could go on and on. You know, one of the things that, you know, Jack London was living in Glen Ellen and thereabouts. And what did he do when the quake happened? He got on a horse and raced for the city so he could report. And his firsthand accounts, I mean, the San Francisco Historical Society and Museum, I mean, there's just incredible stuff, firsthand accounts that you can get just Googling.
Wonderful. Well, it's about 8:02, so I guess if there are no more questions, we can begin to close. And that's a nice segue into reminding you all that if you would like to purchase a copy of Carol's book, VERA, you can find it at Napa Book Mine. We have 3 locations, or you can shop online at napabookmine.com. And
I'm happy. I have these really lovely book plates. And if people want me to inscribe them, I'm really happy to send them to you guys at Bookmine, and would love to do that. So if anybody wants a personalized something to give as a gift or for yourself, I'm happy to do that.
Wonderful. And if you would like one of those, if you order online, you can just include a note in the comments of your order, or you can always email us, and our email is read@napabookmine.com. So this has been such a lovely evening. Thank you so much, both Carol and Holly, for joining us tonight. This was a wonderful conversation.
A pleasure. Thank you.
And hopefully we will be able to see all of you in our store sometime in the near future. So,
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Holly. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.